Hey team, we're going to learn how to create a custom adapter in NextAuth.js using HarperDB. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. This video is brought to you and sponsored by HarperDB. HarperDB is an application platform that gives us a lot of features for building out performant and scalable solutions for the web. This includes tools like easy-to-use databases and custom functions that give us more power for how we interface with our data. Head over to spacejelly.dev/HarperDB and get started with your free instance today. So diving in, we're going to be getting started using HarperDB databases, and specifically, we're going to use a database in order to create a custom NextAuth.js adapter. NextAuth.js is an easy-to-use authentication library for Next.js that allows us to drop in authentication using things like social providers where we can log in with Twitter or Google or really whatever we want. Now, by default, they're going to store your session data locally in your browser, meaning so that if you refresh the page, you can still stay logged in. But what if you want to persist this to a database or some kind of backend system to make sure that you have control over your users, your accounts, and whatever you want to do? So NextAuth.js has the concept of adapters, where we can connect ourselves to a database where they have a few built-in solutions, but what if we want to use a database solution that's not listed inside of here? And that's where custom adapters come in, where we can build our own solution so that we can connect to whatever database we want to use and get productive. Now to see how this works, I'm going to use an existing project of mine called 50 Projects for React and the Static Web, where I'm going to add a login system for this site. Specifically, I have it set up so that if you're not logged in and you try to go to one of the projects, you're not going to get the entire full experience of what you'd get if you sign up with one of your accounts. However, once you sign in with your account, where by default I set up sign in with Twitter, we can see that not only was I given the extra content inside of the page, but I now have this nice little checkbox list where I can check things off and actually be able to keep track of my progress inside of this specific project. But right now, that doesn't actually work. If I click one of those checkboxes and refresh the page, we can see that I completely lose all that state. So what I want to do is anytime someone actually checks off one of those boxes when they're logged in, it's going to store that value inside of the actual database so that when they refresh the page or log in from a different device, they're going to be able to see that. Now, I'm not going to actually cover the process of updating that data. We'll save that for another video. But what we're going to do is learn how to connect our NextAuth.js sessions to that database. So getting started with the code, I have my project 50reactprojects.com on GitHub where I'm going to actually make these changes. So I already have my code checked out locally, but if I open that up inside of my text editor, we can start to poke around the code where particularly if I look in the source and I go to components and I go to my nav component, we can see that I'm pulling in the session from my NextAuth.js section, where if we don't have a session, we're going to show the sign in button. But if we do have the session, we'll show that user's email as well as the button to sign out. The basis of all of this working for NextAuth.js is the actual NextAuth.js configuration, where inside of the Pages API auth folder, we have a NextAuth.js route, where that's going to create an API where all the magic happens, where we can set up our configuration for Twitter, particularly for my example, so that people can actually use that. Now, I'm not going to go through the basics of setting up a new NextAuth.js site for this video. If you want to learn how to do that, you can check out my other video where I'm linking above, where I'll walk you through how to set up a new NextAuth.js site. But once I have that project spun up locally, we can see that I do have that same authentication, where this time I logged in with a different Twitter account, but we can see that I have the ability to sign out, and generally I can manage my sessions inside of this local project with NextAuth.js. Now, heading over to the NextAuth.js docs, a big part of creating a custom adapter is setting up a bunch of configuration. And if we look at this code, which we'll copy later into our project, we can see that we have a bunch of methods that we're creating here. And inside each and every one of those methods, we're going to need to add code that's going to interface with HarperDB in order for it to make those changes, whether it's getting user data or it's actually creating a user or it's updating a user. So starting off, I'm going to go ahead and copy all this code inside of this block. And inside of my project, we could technically probably just paste it into this primary configuration, but that's a lot of code that we would be pasting in there, and we probably want to abstract that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside of my source directory called adapters, and inside of adapters, I'm going to create a new file called HarperDB.js, and inside of there, I'm going to paste in all of that code so that I can start working with those different methods. Now I'm going to make a few little tweaks here where specifically I'm going to remove the default from this function. It's just a little bit cleaner of a way to export it. That way, if we ever need to export something in the future, it's a little less confusing for interfacing with this file. But I'm also going to call this, instead of my adapter, HarperDB adapter. And for that, you can use whatever name you want. We'll import it later from within the NextAuth.js configuration. Now, another thing, if we head over to the documentation for that creating page, if we look through this list, we can see that we have the required methods. Now, these are the ones that someone always has to include for an adapter. But then we have these additional two methods that are only to support email passwordless sign in, which we're not going to do. So we can get rid of those. But we also have these unimplemented methods, meaning that these are methods that aren't going to actually work. So while we can probably put those inside of our adapter, we just need to keep in mind that those two aren't going to work until NextAuth.js actually sets them up inside of a library, which will be in a future release. But for now, let's just get rid of these verification token methods. So at the very bottom, I'm going to also just get rid of those two. And again, we're going to keep those other sessions that are just not implemented yet in the library. Now, if we head over to our NextAuth.js config file, we can now import that adapter. So I'm going to say import my HarperDB adapter, and I'm going to import that from, we're going to go up one level, and another, and then we're going to go to adapters because we need to navigate out of that API folder up into the source directory, where then we're going to go back down into adapters and then HarperDB. And then on the configuration object itself, I'm going to say adapter, and I'm going to set it to that HarperDB adapter, and I'm going to invoke that function. Now, if we head back over to the application, if you were signed in, you'll notice that you're no longer signed in. The issue is we just broke our entire configuration for Next.js because we're implementing that adapter. It doesn't know what to do for all those different methods, so it's not going to work. And if I even tried to sign in and go through Twitter, and it'll even authenticate me like it did before, we can see that it's not going to work. Now, we're not going to try to debug the errors, but we can even see that we are getting errors inside of our console, but that's just simply because we haven't set it up yet. So let's do that now. So to get started, we need to head over to HarperDB, where if you don't have an account yet, make sure you sign up for your free instance, and we can get started with our new database. But once we're signed up and logged in, we can see that we have a new UI where we have the ability to create a new HarperDB cloud instance. And once I click that, we can see that we get instant type selection, where I can choose either AWS or Verizon Wavelength with the HarperDB instance, or a registered user installed instance. Now I want to select create AWS or Verizon Wavelength instance, where we have the option now to choose between AWS or Verizon. I'm going to stick with AWS. You can choose Verizon if you prefer, but I'm going to move forward to AWS and click instance info, where here I need to set up my instance name as well as my credentials. So for my name, I'm going to say my adapter, where you should probably use something that makes sense for your project. And then for my credentials, I'm going to say Colby, and then I'm going to enter a super secure password that you won't be able to see. But once I'm ready, I can click Instant Details, where we can see that I have a few different options for the actual configuration of my instance, where I want to stick with the free tier, so I'm going to stick with the 0.5 GB of RAM, the 1 GB of storage size, and then for my instance region, this could be really whatever you want. Since I'm on US East, I'm going to select Virginia since that's the closest to me, and then I'm going to confirm my instance details. Now here, we're just reviewing all the information that we put in. So everything looks good to me. I'm going to go down and click I agree to HarperDB's privacy policy and TOS. I'm going to click add instance. Now at this point, it's not going to be instantaneously available, as this is actual infrastructure that needs to take a little bit of time to spin up. So it might take a few moments, but you'll eventually get an email to your email address used for your account when the instance is ready to go. But fast forwarding a little bit, we can see that we now have a status of okay. I got that email notification letting me know that it was ready to go. But now we can click into it and we can start to see that we have a blank database that's ready for us to start creating. Now, starting from the top, we have two different concepts that we want to think about here. We have our schemas and we have our tables. Now, tables are just a standard database table, but our schemas is going to represent groups of tables. Now, for our particular project here, we're going to be implementing auth. So I'm going to call my schema auth. I'm going to hit the check mark where I now have my schema of auth. But now I can build all of my tables under that schema. Now, looking back inside of the NextAuth.js documentation, we can see under models, we have a few different things that we're going to need to think about when we're building out these tables. Particularly, we're going to have our user, our account, and our session, where all those things are going to be related. We don't really need to necessarily worry too much about how they relate. It's going to be taken care of on the NextAuth.js side, but those are the different tables that we want to build so that we can store the data related to it. So starting with user, I'm going to create a table called users, and I'm going to specify my hash attribute as ID, which this is going to be our unique value. So every single row is going to have its own unique ID, which is going to also be called the hash attribute. So I'm going to click check, and we can see that we now have a new table without any records. Now, one of the cool things about HarperDB is its dynamic schema, where we don't actually have to go in and create every single new column. When we upload the data or add a record, insert it into our table, it's automatically going to infer all those different column values, or the names rather, so that we don't have to worry about that, and it's going to happen dynamically. So now I'm going to just add those other two tables where we have accounts, and similarly, I'm going to add the hash attribute of ID, as well as my sessions, where I'm going to add the hash attribute of ID. So really, this is all we needed to do inside of HarperDB itself in order to set up our tables. Now we can actually start digging into our code so we can get to the process of being able to send the data to Harper. Now, looking at our different code, everything that we see here is going to have one thing in common. It needs to ultimately make a request to HarperDB, and that needs to be a secure request. So what we can do is we can wrap that base request that allows us to make a query or operation on anything in a function that we're going to call a client, so that we can reuse that client between each of our different requests. So technically, I could probably add this function to the very top of my adapter file where I can use it in all my methods, but what if I want to later use it in another file, such as if I want to update data once I'm authenticated? So what I'm going to do instead is inside of my lib directory, I'm going to create a new file called HarperDB.js, where I'm going to export a new async function called Harper client, where inside we're going to be able to add the request logic. Now, another nice thing about HarperDB is if we head over to the top here and all the way to the right for these navigation items, we see this example code. And if I click this, we can see that under Quick Start Examples, and if I select the programming language that we're going to use, and we're going to use JavaScript Fetch, where we can see that we have a complete code example for how we can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this entire snippet. I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my Harper client file, where now we can see that we have this code, and I want to do a few different things. First of all, I want to make sure that my headers, when I add my authorization header, I'm not going to be adding that in plain text. I want to make sure that that's coming from an environment variable to make sure it's secure, but also so if I have different database environments, I can make sure I can swap that easily. So the first thing I'm going to do is replace these double quotes with the backtick so that I can now make this an environment variable, which I'm going to call process.env.harper API key. Now, of course, we now need to set that Harper API key. So I'm going to copy that value and open up my .env.local, where inside I'm going to add that variable name, and inside we can add the Harper API key that we get from our console. Now back inside Harper Studio, we can see that if we go to the config tab, I'm going to have my instance API auth header for my particular user. So I'm going to copy that value and head back into .env local, where I'm going to paste in that value. Back inside of our Harper client function, we can see that we're also passing in our database instance URL, where we can see that this is actually the right URL for me. But if you ever need to reference it, you can go under the config tab right where we saw the API key. And on the left here, we can see that instance URL, which is going to be where we're going to be making requests to. Now, the only other things I'm going to do is clean this up a little bit just for my personal preferences. I'm going to use const for all these different values. And then at the end here, I like to use async await rather than using chainable thens. So I'm going to say constant, my response is going to be await that fetch request, where then afterwards, I'm still going to turn that into text. So I'm going to say constant data is equal to await response dot text. Then I'm going to get rid of those other lines. Now we're going to do one more thing to this function, which is a little bit more complicated, but when we make this response or request, we're going to get this response, and right now we're turning it into plain text. Now the reason we're not turning it into JSON is if we use that JSON method on the response object, we're going to have some data that's not going to be properly configured for how we want to use it. And in particular, we're going to get a date, the date that it's created, and maybe any other date that you want to store, which isn't going to be available in a date object, complicating how we use it when we're in our application. Now to fix this, we're going to use the JSON.parse method, but what we're going to do is pass in this optional reviver function. And if we scroll down to actually look at what it is, it's going to be a function that we can pass in for how we can change the data to what we need it to be. We can see in a simple example on this same page on MDN that if you pass in this function, if it's a number, it's going to multiply everything by 2. We can see in the JSON parse that it's going to do exactly that. It's going to multiply all those different values by 2. If it's not a number, it's just going to leave it as is. So this is ultimately going to be the value that we return. So I'm going to say return JSON.parse. I'm going to pass in that data, and then we're going to pass in a function for the second argument. Where for the arguments of that function, we're going to get both a key and a value, where I'm going to say, if it's the type of value that I want, I'm going to do my logic here. Otherwise, I'm going to just return the value as is. So we're going to use the date.parse method, where I'm going to pass in that value, and I'm going to check if that value is a number. So I'm going to say, if it's not, is not a number, I'm going to wrap it with that function. If that is the case, we're going to hit this return statement, and I'm going to pass in a new date with that value. So we're basically saying if it is a number, meaning that this parsing is actually working properly, meaning it succeeded, it is a date value, then we're going to take that value and create a new date object and pass it back to our response. The only other thing that we want to do is currently we're passing in a static object into Stringify for our actual body of the request, where we want to make sure that's dynamic, as that's not the only thing we want to do. So I'm going to create an argument of body on the Harper client, and all I'm going to do is replace that static object with the body. Okay, so that should actually do it for our Harper client. So we want to go back into our adapters file, and we want to import our Harper client from going up a level, lib, then HarperDB. Now, as you can imagine, now we're going to work through each and every one of these methods to make sure that we're either doing the operations or queries that we need for that particular method. But rather than doing all those manually and you watching me work through every single one of those line by line, what I'm going to do is paste in each snippet and then talk through them. If you want to find the full code, you can see it in the description. I have a link to my full code source, which in particular is going to be a pull request into my 50 Reacts project, or you can check out the written tutorial, which is also available in the description. Starting with create user, I'm going to paste this in. We're starting from the top. We want to first find out if we have an existing user. If we have an existing user, we don't want to create a new user. So we're going to take this argument of user where we have our ID, or email rather, where we're going to pass into this select statement where we're going to try to see if that user already exists. And if it does exist, we're going to return that user. Now, if it doesn't exist, we're going to create an operation of insert into our table to make sure that we do create that new user using the values provided as that new record. If we get an error, we're going to console log out and throw an error because that shouldn't be part of the workflow. We don't want that to go silent. And then finally, we're going to return that new user along with its ID, which we're going to get as an inserted hash, which if you remember when we were setting up the tables, we have that unique hash attribute. It's going to be that value that's going to be returned in the request so that we can merge that together and pass it back to the application. Now, one thing to point out with these table values and the schema and anything else you see here, this is what I'm using for my application. Now, if you're using this for NextAuth.js, similar to what you're doing, you're probably doing the same thing that I'm doing where auth probably makes sense, but make sure that whatever table and schema values you used, you're actually updating these functions for your own code. Next up is get user, where this one's a little bit simpler. We're going to use that client to just try to see if we can find the existing ID as that record, which would be that hash value that we returned in create user. So once we find that user, we're going to simply pass it back. Get user by email is basically to be the same thing, except we're just looking the user up by their email instead of that ID. Get user by account is a little bit more complicated. Now, the account is going to be the related account for the different providers like Twitter or GitHub or Google, whatever you're logging in with. So we want to look up the account first, which we're going to get using the account ID for that provider and that provider value, where in this example, it could be provider equals Twitter. Provider account ID would be the ID for that provider. So first we're going to look up that account record. If we don't find it, we're going to return since there's no use in continuing. But if we find that account, we're going to use it to get the ID from that record, pass it back so that we can look up the user and pass back the entire user object. Now moving on to updating the user, this is going to be the first time that we're actually changing the data, where we created before but we never updated. So the first thing we want to do is check and see if that user actually exists. So we're going to use that ID and see if we can find that existing user. If they don't exist, we're going to again throw an error as there's nothing we can do, so we should stop that workflow. Then we're going to start to build the user object that we want to mutate. So we take that existing user, we're going to overlay all the different updated attributes that we are trying to pass in from NextAuth.js, and then we're going to pass that in as our hash values. We're going to pass in that user object, and inside of Harper, it's going to be able to match up that ID to make sure that it's updating the right user through that process. Now, if you had a good eye, you might have noticed that I'm redefining my user object here, where currently that's what's set up to be the actual argument from the update user function. Now, I like to use user here. You could really use whatever you want to pass it into the hash values property, but I like to use user just because it makes it more readable for understanding what's actually being passed in. So what I'm going to do is, instead of update user and with the user argument, I'm just going to simply change that to updated user. That way I can make sure that inside of all these queries, I'm going to be matching that value. Now for deleting a user, we're just going to simply run the delete operation and pass in that user ID. And if it doesn't work, we're going to be okay because we want to delete it. So if it doesn't find it, it means that it's already not available. Now for link account, if we remember, the account is going to be the provider account. So if we're logging in with Twitter, this is going to be our Twitter account. So we're going to insert a record for the account. That way we have the relation between the Twitter account and the NextAuth user account. That way we can see those relationships and link to them between each other. Now, unlinking the account is going to be a little bit trickier because we only get the provider account ID and the provider. So we need to first actually look up that account. The nice thing is we already wrote the code for this. So if we go back up to get user by account, we can see that we're already making that request to find the account. So we can use that to get started. So inside unlink account, I'm going to first paste in that account request, where then I can do a similar thing that I did with the delete user, where I'm going to paste in that delete operation, where I'm going to say that I want to delete the account with that ID. I'm going to say under auth accounts is where I'm going to delete it from. And then we have all the information for sessions. We're starting at the top. I'm going to paste in my insertion for the sessions. And what I'm going to do is, instead of trying to pass in all these individual values, I'm going to turn this into a single object where I'm going to pass that in directly. That way, for whatever data that NextAuth.js wants to add to that session object, it's going to automatically post into my new sessions record. Now, get session and user is slightly more complicated just because it includes more steps. But what we're going to do is we're going to first look up that session by the session token. We're going to see that if we don't have a session, we might as well bail because we have no data to look up. But then once we have that session, we're going to look up the user that's associated with that session, where we can use the user ID on that value. If we don't have the user, again, we can bail because there's nothing that we can pass back. But finally, if we do, we're going to return an object that has both that session and that user. Now for updating the session, like we did a little bit earlier, we want to first check if that session exists. If it doesn't exist, we're going to throw an error because we need to ultimately do that as part of our workflow. But if it does exist, we're going to continue through. We're going to update it using the ID and the rest of the session value. And finally, we have deleting the session, where here we want to first look up the existing session because we only have the token. So we want to make sure we can first find it. But then once we do have that existing session, we're going to pass it into the client, where we're going to run a delete operation on that sessions table and pass in that existing ID. Now that was a lot, but that's all the operations that we're going to need in order to make NextAuth.js interface with a custom database. And the nice thing is this adapter is now reusable and you can use it anywhere. So you can abstract this and publish it or do whatever you want with your custom adapter so that you don't have to write this same code every single time. But now we can test this out. So inside of my application, I'm going to go to sign in, where I'm going to click sign in with Twitter, and it's going to take me back through that authentication flow, redirect me back to the application, and we can see that success, I am now signed in to my Cosmo address. Now bonus, if I go back into Harper Studio and I click around to refresh the actual records, we can see that I now have my Twitter account stored inside of my account's records. If I go to sessions, I can see that new session that I created. If I go to users, I can see my new user account for my NextAuth.js session. Now just to test this out and prove that it works, if I sign out and I log into one of my other accounts, we can see that it's successfully logged in. And if I head over to Harper Studio and do the same thing, click around, we can see that I do now have that new user account in there. If I go to sessions, we can see that I have 3 because I actually signed out and backed in when I wasn't recording this video, but we can see that we do have only 2 accounts because we now have only those 2 registered users. This is awesome because this now gives us the ability to extend the abilities of NextAuth.js, which is our awesome way to provide authentication, and be able to take this and now use it to store data about our application, which now we can do things like store the data for all of our to-do list items, which we'll see maybe in a later video. We can also be sure that we can rely on our database where we can now have all of our records in place so that we can make sure that whatever device the person tries to log in, we can restore their account and anything associated with it from our HarperDB records. Custom adapters are a great way to extend NextAuth.js so that we can bring the databases we love, like HarperDB, into our workflows. What's your favorite use case for working with databases? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about how you can build pages, especially dynamic pages, once you have your authentication in place, check out my video, Create Pages and Fetch Data in Next.js using static and dynamic routes. Or if you want to learn how to add more interaction to your application once they're logged in, such as maybe you want to add drag and drop to make it easy to rearrange all those to-do lists, check out my video, Adding Drag and Drop in React with React Beautiful D&D. Thanks HarperDB for sponsoring this video, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.